I cover fringe topics from giants to extraterrestrials. But before you cross that threshold, I want to leave you with this thought. Don't forget, oftentimes, the truth is stranger than fiction. Now let's get started with today's video. This is the story of a Lemurian princess who emerged from inner Earth and shared the secrets of the subterranean cities. Her name, Sharula Dux, and her parents were the king and queen of Telos. The princess left her home in the capital city of Agartha to come to the surface and teach humanity about the higher truths they've been practicing and living for thousands of years. Whether you believe it or not, her story will leave you amazed and inspired. When you hear how a Telosian lives his or her life in inner Earth, it'll make you rethink everything you ever learned on the surface. So don't go away. You don't want to miss out on this one. The tale of inner Earth began almost 100,000 years ago when the people of Hyperborea had to vacate their continent. The Hyperboreans had to relocate because Mother Earth started losing her mantle, which opened up the planet to radioactive waves, the likes of which their civilization that had reigned for millions of years had never seen before. So nearing the point of extinction, they were forced to move underground, where they still thrive to this day. Flash forward to almost 65,000 years later. The radioactivity has ceased and the Earth is now inhabited by the Anunnaki, Atlanteans, and Lemurians. How they all came to be on Earth? The Anunnaki, who inhabit planet Nibiru, are also the Draconian race. They are a warring faction, always looking to conquer. Their 3,000-year orbit brought them near our solar system, and also planet Tiamat. An ancient alien race known as the Agigi called this planet home. They were highly technologically advanced and had a thriving civilization. Their technology was thousands and thousands of years ahead of what ours is today. They could do and accomplish things you and I couldn't even fathom, using things like sacred geometry. But unfortunately, they caught the eye of the ancient Anunnaki. So they set out to conquer planet Tiamat and take the Agigi as slaves. The Agigi, who were inherently beings of light, fought valiantly and gave it everything they had. But in the end, they stood no chance against the Anunnaki's planet-killing weapon. And after gathering up enough Agigi to do their bidding and be slaves for them on Earth, using direct energy weapons, they created a Death Star-like scenario for planet Tiamat, blowing it to smithereens. The end result is what we now call the asteroid belt. Why the Anunnaki wanted to enslave the Agigi is because they had ruined the atmosphere on their own planet, resulting from nuclear war. Though it was still habitable, their planet was suffering, and so was their civilization. So they invented a machine that could break down gold into its monoatomic form. They'd then fire the broken down gold into their atmosphere in hopes that it would regenerate it. This process took tonnage of gold to complete. So they needed literally mountains of it. And where did they find a good source of gold? On Earth. So the Anunnaki used this ancient advanced super civilization in the Agigi as slaves to harvest gold. This went on for thousands of years until the Agigi grew tired of it. They'd revolt, gaining their freedom. Shortly after gaining their freedom, the Agigi split into two different factions so they could spread their love and light across the globe. One became the Lemurians, the other the Atlanteans. The Lemurians inhabiting Lemuria or continent Mu, the Atlanteans Atlantis. In the meantime, the Anunnaki were still allowed to harvest gold. That's when they created humans. And for a few more thousand years, we were the slaves working the gold mines. During this time, the Anunnaki were able to infiltrate the Atlantean society, convincing them that lesser beings should be slaves and that it was their right to rule over them. So they forced us to do backbreaking labor for millennia, until the Lemurians had had enough. They spoke up. They believed that all beings on Earth had an equal right to attempt to thrive and evolve as a species, while the Atlanteans and Anunnaki did not. A war broke out. Flash forward to almost 65,000 years later. The radioactivity has ceased and the Earth is now inhabited by the Anunnaki, Atlanteans, and Lemurians. How they all came to be on Earth? The Anunnaki, who inhabit planet Nibiru, are also the Draconian race. They are a warring faction, always looking to conquer. Their 3,000-year orbit brought them near our solar system. So the third great antediluvian Earth War started. Antediluvian meaning before the biblical flood. The war between the two sides broke out over differing ideologies of enslaving lesser beings on Earth. The Draconian Anunnaki and the Atlanteans against the Lemurians and all the other beings of Earth. During these series of wars, thermonuclear devices were used. It ended up being the greatest Earth war this planet had ever seen. When the fighting had stopped and all the dust had cleared, the Atlanteans and Lemurians realized there really was no winner in this battle. The Australian outback, the Gobi Desert, The Mojave and the Sahara are all reminders of what nuclear war on Earth can result in. During the conflict, what were supposed to be super advanced civilizations stooped to low levels, realizing they became victims of their own aggression and that such behavior was futile to their species. But it must be pointed out that at the end of the day, you and I are not slaves. The war raged on 10,000 years before the fighting finally stopped. But the damage from the nukes was irreversible. Cataclysms would ensue. By the time the second set of earthquakes, cataclysms, volcanoes ravaged the Earth, Mu and Atlantis had been broken down to just mere island chains. They could tell simply by the Earth's frequency that their continents had maybe 15,000 years before they'd sink to the bottom of the ocean. I know 15,000 years seems like a long time, but to the Atlanteans and Lemurians, it's nothing. Their people could live to be up to 30,000 years old. So they realized a large number that took part in the war would see the end of its destruction. It turns out their prediction would be spot on. Almost 15,000 years later, 200 years before Atlantis sunk, Lemuria would sink to the bottom of the ocean. But not before Lemurians and Atlanteans petitioned Shambhala the Lesser. Shambhala the Lesser would allow the Lemurians in, and some Atlanteans who were inherently good were allowed in as well, the ones of love and light. Now, a few of the evil Anunnaki and Atlanteans stayed on Earth, while the majority flew off planet. In the meantime, the good factions would have to find their place in Shambhala the Lesser. So Mount Shasta, California would be where the Lemurians decided to make their homeland. During this time, before Lemuria sank, California was actually a part of its colonies. They were part of the Lemurian homelands. Lemurians chose Mount Shasta because they knew it would survive the cataclysms. And Telos was actually the name of that area. It covered much of the southwest of California. Mount Shasta already being a place of great sacredness. Telos meant communication with spirit, oneness with spirit, and understanding of spirit. They built it to hold up to 2 million people, but by the time the cataclysms hit, only 25,000 were saved. And at this time, they had already established many of the temples and pyramids within Mount Shasta, so they were able to save all of the Lemurian records. While Lemuria was coping with the aftermath of what happened, earthquakes continued. These earthquakes were so intense that just the sound alone could end your life. And when Lemuria finally sank, they got even more intense. Many believe they would have reached up to 15 on our Richter scale today. Civilizations across the world that were built on mostly clay, their earthquakes were so intense that it actually liquefied the clay, sinking whole cities. When a continent sinks, it affects the entirety of the world. When Lemuria finally gave away and sank to the bottom of the ocean, it created one of the most massive tidal waves the world has ever seen. In many areas, the water didn't reach just hundreds of miles inland, but thousands of miles inland. Meaning that if one hit the coast of California, it would go as far as Oklahoma City. This is why they tried to construct all the major cities before Lemuria herself sank. And they were able to get much of it done, including the Great Pyramid of Egypt. This was ordered to be done by the Lemuria High Priest, known better today as Egyptian god Thoth or Thoth, the god of wisdom, knowledge, and science, believed to have brought the world sacred geometry. This pyramid was built to house the records of the Atlanteans, Lemurians, Hyperboreans, or any other civilization that reached great stature on the planet Earth. Again, the Atlanteans that were inherently good were allowed to build a city as well, the ones that fought alongside the Lemurians. They moved in just as Lemuria sank, and for the next 200 years, large portions of Atlantis would sink as well. Earthquakes would continue for 2,000 more years, reducing almost every civilization on Earth to rubble. The Atlanteans chose to build their city under Mato Grosso, which is now much of Brazil. The few civilizations that stayed on the surface would lose their technology rapidly, because volcanic ash would blot out the sun. The volcanic eruptions and the nuclear explosions threw so much debris in the air, it didn't become daylight till almost 300 years after Atlantis sank. This would cause many of the plant and animal life forms on Earth to go extinct. Both plants and animals that existed during Lemurian and Atlantean times do not exist today. Of course, there were a few that did survive, along with some human civilizations as well. These people saw terrible suffering. They were rampant with hunger and disease. Many moved out of the large cities into the country in fear that a building could collapse at any moment. Even some of their strongest buildings could only withstand 300 to 400 earthquakes. Then it was inevitable. They would fall. Some that did survive were the pyramids because they were built to withstand the earthquakes and because they were constructed using sacred geometry. So civilizations on the surface would survive as best they could. During this time, there was a large integration into the Agartha network. The Agartha network is made up of over 120 subterranean cities. City of Telos is the capital of it, near Mount Shasta. Some of them were built during the Shambhala the Lesser times, when the Hyperboreans first established underground cities. These beings were 12 feet tall. In fact, this planet, along with many other planets in the solar system, had humanoid species this height. When we lost the mantle and started reaching more and more rays from the sun, man shrunk. We went from an average of 12 feet to 7 feet. So the Lemurians and Atlanteans were on average 7 to 8 feet. And we still continued to shrink for thousands of years, as many people throughout history were only 5 feet tall. Now people average around 6 feet tall. So essentially this effect has started to reverse itself, and we're getting the height back that we once had. In the Agartha network, the only cities allowed to join were cities of light. Aside from the capital, there are 4 more cities, with Lemurian technology and Lemurian beliefs. One is called Rama, underneath India. The others that hold allegiance to the Lemurians are called the Ulgar cities. One of them is the city of Shonshi, which is under Tibet, and is being protected and hidden by a Tibetan lamasery. The Ulgar people left Lemuria 40 to 50,000 years ago and split off into their own faction. They covered most of the area of Asia. These people inhabited the second Ulgar city, Shingla, and this is located under the Gobi Desert. The last city is built above the Atlantean city, and they call this Pozdid. The Atlantean city under Mato Grosso Plateau in Brazil consists of many other larger cities around it, some of them going under the Atlantic Ocean. And there's many small satellite cities that cover the entirety of the planet. That's basically how all these advanced civilizations ended up underground. This is where the princess starts explaining how they live, from their relationships to their family dynamics, to their diets and their wildlife. Comment below what you think of these stories, and like, subscribe, and follow for more.